an industrial policy that worked. It's been said that the Israeli economy experienced two great leaps between stagnation and hyperinflation. The first leap was from independence in 1948 until 1970, when there was an entrepreneurial government and a small private sector. During those decades, GDP quadrupled while population tripled. The second leap was from 1990 until the present, which has seen an entrepreneurial private sector catalyzed by the government. How did Israel's industrial policy get its start? Historically, we have to go back to the year 1883 and consider French-Jewish banker Edmond de Rothschild, a major philanthropist for the Jewish community that was growing in Palestine in those days. Much of the coastal area was infected with malarial swamps, and practical solutions were required. The advice? Plant eucalyptus trees, because their roots absorb substantial amounts of water. Over time, voila, no more malarial swamps. And over time, the early charity-based economy was supplanted by a pioneering ethos. In 1906, David Ben-Gurion, who came to be known as Israel's first prime minister, originally David Gruen, arrived from Poland. As an organizer of Zionism, his goal was to help absorb waves of new Jewish immigrants. But he faced considerable challenges. The British White Paper, perhaps the greatest, which drastically reduced and virtually choked off Jewish immigration to Palestine. And it came at the worst possible time, just prior to Hitler's campaign of genocide. Ben-Gurion launched two seemingly contradictory campaigns of his own. He famously declared, "We shall fight the White Paper as if there were no Hitler, and we shall fight Hitler as if there were no White Paper." A special underground agency was also created to transport Jewish refugees undercover. It was called Aliyah Bet, the illegal immigration. In other words, we will bring Jews into Palestine by hook or by crook. A common argument is made that Ben-Gurion was pretty much a socialist, and that Israel was at its inception a socialist state. But that just might be a myth. The counter-argument is that Ben-Gurion was in actuality a pragmatist. In Hebrew, a bitzuist, one who has to choose to get things done. Bitzuism, as it's called, is actually at the heart of the pioneering ethos. And come to think of it, that's quite a compliment. The qualities of the early pioneers, or chalutzim, were wide and varied. They were crusty, resourceful, impatient, sardonic, effective, and not much in need of thought or sleep. Ben-Gurion, for his part, was intensely focused on settlement, which he knew was vital for the existence and survival of the Jewish state. Furthermore, he was ready to turn conventional wisdom on its head and lure settlers away from urban centers toward underdeveloped areas. Such areas included the arid south, the Negev desert. Ben-Gurion also understood that private capitalists weren't ready to take such risks, so the government needed to take the lead. Does that make Ben-Gurion a socialist or a pragmatist? However we choose to argue it or understand what he was up to, the legacy he created was an informal governmental meddling in the economy. One of the unique Israeli institutions that came about as a result of such early policies was the kibbutz, which literally means gathering, and amounted to a truly communal farm. The kibbutz has in fact been the world's most successful communal movement. Everything was to be held in common. It abolished private property and promoted strict equality for each member. Though the kibbutzim, plural of kibbutz, never amounted to more than 4% of the population, they produced an amazing 15% of the members of Israel's parliament, the Knesset, and they produced an even greater percentage of IDF officers and pilots. The attributes of the kibbutzniks, or kibbutz members, included hardiness, informality, and asceticism, that is, self-denial. Their self-government, always hotly debated, had no police, nor did they allow private money. They even went as far as to raise their children communally. Life on the kibbutz also highlights another unique Israeli quality: turning problems and challenges into assets. One example being a serious lack of water. After all, 95% of Israel is semi-arid, arid, or hyper-arid. It's no accident that Israel has become a leader in desert agriculture, specializing in a relatively new technique known as drip irrigation, pioneered by an Israeli company called Netafim, which literally means drips. And the kibbutz is in the forefront of this revolutionary agricultural process. Thanks to drip irrigation, there's actually been a reversal of the encroachment of the Negev desert. Nowadays, we're seeing green where it doesn't seem to belong. And speaking of water, over 70% of Israel's water is recycled, leading the world in water reuse. Such water is used in fish ponds, and then containing waste products used again in irrigation. Israelis also figured out how to grow fruits and vegetables directly from the underground aquifer. Then there's the example of forestation. Since the birth of the state, Israelis have planted some 240 million trees. Consider, for instance, the Yatir forest on the edge of the Negev desert, which is growing faster than anyone expected. And in spite of very little annual rainfall, it soaks up as much carbon dioxide as lush forests elsewhere in the world. The forest is even visible from satellite imagery, appearing as a sort of green triangle in the midst of brown, barren desert. The lesson from this not so little experiment? trees can survive and even thrive in desert areas. And what about worldwide lessons? Consider this: planting forests on just 12% of semi-arid lands across the globe could reduce atmospheric carbon by a gigaton per year. Consider also that in 2008, Ben Gurion University was home to the UN Conference on Desertification. Because the fact is, Israel is the only country in the world whose desert is receding. Another remarkable aspect of Israel is the leapfrog phenomenon. Between 1950 and 1955, Israel shrank its per capita wealth gap with rich countries. Between 1950 and 1960, Israel doubled its living standards. Yet, all the while, its government remained basically hostile to private profit. It was, if anything, anti-free market, and consequently opposed by not a few critics. The accusation was that however fast Israel's economy had grown, it might have grown even faster without such policies. And that's an issue to debate. A counter-argument, however, is that this growth occurred at least in part because of government meddling. What specifically did this meddling include? The government invested in roads, water systems, factories, ports, electrical grids, and housing. It also developed the national water carrier, running all the way from Galilee to the Negev desert. Contrast that with many developing countries that waste large amounts of money on infrastructure, largely due to corruption. We have to admit that Israel is not a perfect exception to this rule, but his record in terms of tangible accomplishment speaks for itself. There's another entrepreneurial project that came from within the government. It arose from smuggling weapons during the 1948 War of Independence that, in a roundabout way, gave birth to Israel's aeronautics industry. As it happened, Shimon Peres convinced David Ben-Gurion that Israel could repair surplus World War II aircraft. And voila, Israel Aircraft Industries was born. Later in the history of the new nation, there came a transition to a private entrepreneurial economy. The argument is that this transition should have come about in the 1960s. But needed reforms were staved off by the 1967 Six-Day War. At the same time, the government embarked on a costly new infrastructure program, a stimulus program. And that's yet another issue we can debate. Does anything good come from stimulus programs? For Israel, it amounted basically to a lost decade and a recipe for disaster. In 1973, the Yom Kippur War brought with it enormous casualties for a small country the size of Israel. There was huge damage to the country's infrastructure. There was a loss of labor force, and business activity halted. Instead of allowing salaries to fall, the government propped them up. There was huge public debt, and tax rates increased, including on venture capital. In the short term, high-priced debt was used to finance the growing deficit, increasing interest payments. And immigration plummeted. From the mid-1970s to the mid-1980s, Israel basically resembled a third world country. It's a period I witnessed myself when I resided both in Jerusalem and northern Galilee. The infrastructure was antiquated. The airport was small. There were no major roads. TV reception was poor. There was only one station. Supermarkets were rare, with no retail chains. There were long waiting lists for phones. And there were high import tariffs. Cars were a mix of Subarus and Citroens. And by the way, it was illegal to change dollars. Not a pretty picture. Golda Meir resigned. So did Yitzhak Rabin, his wife being embroiled in a foreign bank account scandal. The early 1980s brought hyperinflation as people began hoarding telephone tokens, which at least kept their value better than coins. There was also the policy of indexing. Wages and prices were linked to inflation, and that caused an endless spiral. Then came the turnaround. The first phase was when Intel set up shop in Israel in the 1970s. The second phase began in 1990 when Shimon Peres, in consultation with George Shultz, the American, introduced a stabilization plan. Public debt was cut, spending was limited, and a policy of privatization was introduced. Today in Israel, there are more cell phones per capita than anywhere in the world. The country is home to IBM, Texas Instruments, and even McDonald's made its entrance in 1993. But 3 more ingredients were needed. A new wave of immigrants, another war, and a new and revitalized venture capital industry. The result would be nothing short of astonishing.